Hey guys, welcome. Appreciate you all hopping on. Um, this was supposed to be a class where I did some CE, but the Trek has not gotten my courses approved yet. But they are close. I already checked for them. So next month we will be able to convene maybe the last week of the month and do some free CE for you. But today I wanted to go over a couple key elements of 5 or 6 contracts. We're not going to go through every component because it would just take too long. But I did kind of parse out some things I wanted to mention to you today, especially as we kind of ramp up into the busy time of year. Let me share my screen. And I am going to start with our old friend here, the 1-to-4 family residential contract. And I could spend an entire day going through this contract, but one of the things that I wanted to point out to you comes in, let's see if I can find it, in the paragraph that talks about accepting the property as is. Did I miss it? Hang on. Okay. Yeah, it's at the very top of page 5. So it basically says that, let's just go back to the paragraph, acceptance of property as is means the present condition of the property with any and all defects and without warranty, except for the warranties of title and the warranties in this contract. So all that to say that 9 times out of 10, you're going to check box D1. Buyer accepts property as is. Now, that does not mean that the buyer isn't able to conduct an inspection and then come back, obviously during their option period, because we have an option period here in Texas, and ask for repairs to things that are revealed from the inspection. Okay, that will always be the case. All right. However, option D2, if you read here, it says buyer accepts the property as is, provided that the seller, at seller's expense, shall complete the following specific repairs and treatments. Okay, so what would you put in here and when would you do that? Well, if the buyer and you walk up to the property and let's say we had one of our famous Texas windstorms and a large branch went through the window of the upstairs bedroom, and you and your buyer go to look at the property, you want to put in an offer, and common sense would tell you that the seller is going to fix that, but you never want to chance it. And so that is a known defect seen with the naked eye that you want to point out that that's fixed. Okay, so that would be one instance. The other instance would be, and I would strongly encourage you to do this, especially on a pre-owned home, if you want to make sure that when the current sellers move out, it is clean and or professionally clean. That's where you would put that in here in D2. All right, again, common sense would suggest that if the seller is moving out, then the buyer should acquire that property in some reasonably clean fashion. You would be surprised what buyers have to walk into. So I would suggest that you always check that and write that in there, unless it's obvious that it's going to be just fine for the buyer. But that is what I wanted to call out on today's meeting with regards to this section of the 1-to-4. Okay, so 2 reasons you would do that. One, you want the thing professionally cleaned and you want it written in there, or you do see a visible defect like a broken window and you want to record that so that it does get fixed. So I'm actually in a situation / dispute today because the buyer doesn't think that the home that they're moving into, which we are listing, is quote unquote clean enough. Okay, so it all becomes very subjective, and I love how they infuse this degree of dysfunction on closing date. I think I left that out. Today's closing, um, and they're kind of playing that card. Okay, so just be mindful that if your buyers want that, that's where you put it. Okay, let's talk about contingencies. So this is going to be common, and it's going to be even more common that your buyers get an accepted contract by a seller, knowing that your buyer has to sell their other property to buy the one that you're showing them. Okay, so this is one of those forms that does not have the word contingency in it. So if you're looking in zip forms for that word, it's not going to come up. It is formally called addendum for sale of other property by buyer. All right, so it's pretty basic, but I wanted to point out a couple of things. So in paragraph A, it says this contract, meaning the 1 to 4, is contingent upon buyer's receipt of the proceeds. They got to have the money from the sale of buyer's property at whatever address that is. Okay, on or before whatever date it is scheduled to close. Okay, so this is going to be forever known as the contingency. If the contingency is not satisfied, in other words, if they don't sell that home by the date that you put in this paragraph, or it's not waived by them, or is waived by the buyer by the above date, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So a couple of things here. If you represent a buyer that's in this situation, it is going to be on a scale of 1 to 10, probably a 1 that your contract's going to get accepted if your buyer's house is not at least on the market. The chances increase if your buyer's house is on the market, it's gotten a contract, and you're out of option. Okay, and that buyer doesn't have a contingency, right? So it's sometimes all these dominoes kind of have to fall. But if you get a very eager buyer that has to go sell their home but wants you to take them out and go look at other homes, you may want to pump the brakes on that, because it's going to be rare that your contract is going to be accepted if you don't at least have the thing under contract and a closing date set. Okay, because this row here, you're going to have to put a date. And so usually you'll put, let's say, March 1st closing, and then I think March 1st is tomorrow. So, then you'd put maybe March 4th as the closing for whatever property you're putting an offer in on. So it's going to be a very, very tight turn. So everything in our world has to go correctly for this to work. So be mindful of where your buyer's listing is in this process. Okay, so let's go down to paragraph B. Has anyone ever heard of the term active option kickout or a kickout clause? Okay, so not many agents know what this is, so I'm here to explain it to you. That's really paragraph B, and that means that it reads, if the seller accepts another offer, a written offer, on the property while you are under contract with your buyer, seller is going to notify your buyer of that, and the seller is going to require the buyer to waive the contingency. Okay, which means that they're going to have to just ignore the fact that they have to go sell this other property to pay for this one. Okay, it kind of seems like an oxymoron, but your buyer would have to have the cash funds to be able to do that, or they're going to have to drop out. Okay, so reading on, it says buyer must waive contingency on or before the blank day after the seller's notice to buyer. Otherwise, the contract is going to terminate and the earnest money is going to be refunded to the buyer. So this also decreases your chances of your offer being accepted if you leave this blank. So basically you're saying, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I want to buy your house. This is the price. If you accept it, great, but I have to go sell my other one to go pay for this one. However, in exchange for your flexibility, I'm going to allow you to entertain other offers. Just give me some time to decide whether or not to move forward or terminate. And that goes in paragraph B. Okay. And I would suggest 2 days, no more than 2 days. Okay. So then it says, paragraph 3, buyer may waive the contingency only by notifying the seller of the waiver and depositing more money as earnest money. Okay, so why would you do that? Because if you're going to waive the contingency, but the buyer still knows that they have to sell that home to go buy this one, the seller wants more skin in the game. Okay, so that is basically all there is to a contingency offer. So this has to be submitted along with your other paperwork. So let me do something else here. I'm going to log into the MLS for DFW. And wherever you're calling from, yours may look a little bit different. But I want to follow up on this concept of what an active option kickout listing is. If you have a buyer that doesn't need to go sell their home and you're searching for listings, normally you're searching for only active things, right? You're not going to show them active contingent. You're not going to show them active kickout. You're not going to show them active option contract, but I suggest that you do. So an active option kickout is going to be all those listings that have that clause. And the sellers are very open to taking a stronger offer if it means that their current buyer doesn't have to sell another home. So if you have a buyer that is not in that situation, please don't eliminate these active kickout listings, because the chances are pretty good that if your buyer has a strong enough offer, that seller will in essence kick out the other buyer. Okay, so any questions on the contingency form? I said this was going to be Q&A, so if you have any questions on the contingency process, you'll have to unmute and ask your question. No? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's Lily. I just want to mention that still working with a lender currently. We would definitely have to review the contract to make sure that it's accepted by us with a contingency. So I don't know if anybody's come across that, but we would definitely have to look at that to make sure. And if it wasn't accepted, obviously it would be a dead deal, you know, because they would have to sell the current home in order to buy the new home. So just a comment.
That's a really good point. I completely glossed over the lender piece, which is the most important part. So none of this works if your buyer's lender says it ain't going to work. All right. So to Lily's point, most people can't qualify if they have 2 mortgages. And so the lender would have to review all this to make sure that they can qualify. Now, that's done on the front end. So before any paperwork signed anyway, you know, your buyer has to clarify with their lender, hey, I need to go sell another home to go buy homes now. Maybe I'm relocating from another state. Let me know what parameters I need to work within. All right, so that's actually a really good point.
Hey, Brad, I wanted to mention something too. I know that we've talked about it in the past, HomeWorks programs, you know, the buy before you sell program.
Yep.
That would be, you know, if you're representing the buyer, that's an option to look into as well. That way you can make a basically equivalent of a cash offer on the home that you're buying prior to even listing your existing home.
Correct. Yeah. So what Jeff is getting at is there are companies out there that will agree to buy the home that they have to go sell ahead of time, so that you can kind of move forward with purchasing the home wherever it is you're going to be. So good point. All right. The other contract I get questions on is not the amendment per se, but how to submit repair requests. So there is, this amendment is great. It's a one-pager. It's a catch-all. If, lines 1 through 8 speak to something in the 1 to 4, but there's also an other in option 9. But if you're submitting a repair request, typically the flow of that process is that you're within your option period. The buyer hires an inspector to look for stuff. He or she finds it, and you and the client decide what you want to ask the seller to address. And in paragraph 2, it actually says, in addition to any repairs and treatments otherwise required by the contract, seller, at seller's expense, shall complete the following repairs and treatments. And notice, paragraph 7 of the contract, whenever they say contract, I mean the 1 to 4, governs the completion, delivery of documentation, and transfer of warranties of repairs and treatments. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at paragraph 7, it's very explicit as to who can do the repairs and how the seller is going to prove that they were done. And in a nutshell, it says that the owner really can't do any of the repairs. They've got to hire a company that is in business to do those repairs or licensed to do those repairs. And then, oh, by the way, you have to provide documentation that proves that they were done. So for years, now that detail of that language did not exist until recently. And so a lot of agents would put in, please provide receipts for the repairs. You don't need to do that. It's already covered. Okay. But chances are the repairs that you're asking for are not going to fit in this space. Okay. So if they do, great. But if they don't, you can always come down to other. And this is from our website under the contracts tab. And in my example, I say, seller to repair or replace the following as per the inspection report. Leaking kitchen faucet, breaker number 7, which is from the breaker box, right? HVAC completely serviced, 2 windows in front living room to be replaced. So if you read carefully, I phrased it in a certain way. And the first thing I want to call out is I referenced the inspection report. So a lot of times I'll get the question, do I need to give the entire inspection report to the other agent? And the answer is no. But I would, if you reference the inspection report here, you want to make darn sure that they have something visual to go back to and create context so that the person knows exactly what you want fixed. So I would give the pages that speak to the repairs that you want done. Okay. I also use the word repair or replace, or in my last example, 2 windows in front living room to be replaced. So you can't be vague when you're asking for repairs, because again, just like my example of the buyer didn't want to close because they didn't think the home was clean enough, these repairs can be extremely subjective, right? Servicing the AC unit may have a different meaning for the seller than it does for the buyer. Leaking kitchen faucet even might be too vague if there's another faucet in there, or if the pipe below the sink is the thing that's dripping. I mean, you need to be painfully specific because you don't want any gray area in terms of what the buyer really meant. Okay, so
Another thing too, Brad, from a
Yep.
contractor's perspective, this is a work order. So
Exactly.
if you're not really specific, then they don't know exactly what it is that you want fixed. So,
Exactly. Yep. Exactly right. Um, so in the spirit of kind of keeping with the normal flow of the inspection, or sorry, termination period or option period, um, this is why the inspection has to be done like on day one, day two at the latest, right? Because you want to have time to get the inspection done, that 50-page report given back to you, time to kind of digest it, time to sift through, what is really important and what sets a buyer off, and then enough time to write this document, get it to the seller, and give them time to respond. So, I mean, I just covered a lot of time there. So it is not fair and not reasonable to drag your feet and expect that you're going to turn this in on the last day of the option period and get a reasonable response. It is not the seller's fault. Okay. So there are a million inspection companies out there. If someone can't get out there within 24 hours, go to the next one. All right. But if your buyer is going to execute a contract and then all of a sudden have to be out of town for the next 7 days, that ain't going to work either. They've got to be available and accessible and ready to initial and talk about these repairs. Okay. Now the good news is that once this is kind of put to bed, there ain't much to do, right? But the first 7 days or the first 10 days, whatever your option period is critical. All right. Because what is not a big deal today, all of a sudden becomes a screaming big deal on the closing day or the day after. Right. Buyers move in. Wait a second, this faucet's leaking. I thought we could know. So please act within what's reasonable so that everybody has a chance to respond to repair requests. Okay. Any questions on that? Who pays for the inspection? The buyer. Buyer does. All right. And let's see. I want to make sure. Okay. No, I wanted to raise one more point. I'll cover that in the seller's disclosure. I just have my little notes here. All right. So any questions on the repair amendment or just the amendment in general? Okay. All right. Moving on to the seller's disclosure. So my first suggestion is that your local realtor board has a version of this, NAR has a version of this, and TAR has a version of this, and TREC. My suggestion is to go with the one that you see here from our association because it's the most comprehensive. Okay, so rule number one, you don't fill this out for the seller. Rule number two, you don't sign it for the seller. Okay, so the first section speaks to, and I would give this to your seller and say, this is a serious document. It's 7 pages long. I know there's a lot here, but if you don't fill this in accurately and completely, you're going to expose yourself to a very real lawsuit. So please be honest, please be transparent, and please be thorough. So the section one is, does this property have any of these things? Now, if a homeowner, whether they've lived in their home for a year or 20 years, may not know the answer to these things. But just because there's a U for unknown doesn't mean they get a pass. All right. So they've just added stuff in here about the piping because it's become a big deal. Okay. So in my opinion, I would tell them that it's either a yes or no. I mean, you can't not know what the roof is made of. You can't not know what the plumbing is made of. Okay, they've got to know that stuff. Okay, so if you get the seller's disclosure back and there are unknowns, or you got to make sure that every blank is filled in, please push back and ask them, are you sure you don't know this? Are you sure that you wanted to leave this blank? Okay, so there's usually always a story that I have with each of these. And so my story today is Jeff, and Jeff, you'll appreciate this. The stars were aligned on this day, this week. It's, well, and hang on, let me see. Yeah, I'll go to the mud in a second. Had an agent that had clients that had been searching forever for a home. They finally found one. They offer way above list to get it. And it was built in 87, so not that old. And they do an inspection. And before they do the inspection, the inspector must have said, do you want me to do a sewer camera inspection? And the agent didn't quite know either what that was or how to respond to that. And I said, if they're offering, I would do one. And thank the Lord I said that, because they did. And come to find out, the house, built only in 1987, had cast iron pipes. And oh, by the way, the camera uncovered a weak spot in the pipe, in one of the pipes. And so what that means, for some of you that don't realize how big of a deal that is that cast iron corrodes, and they don't even use it anymore. And it's not just the pipe that delivers water from the house to the street. The entire structure had cast iron pipes. And the inspector just kind of innocently said that because of what he found, if you need to redo these pipes, you're looking at a $50,000 price tag. And the buyers did not back out easily because they had come so far. And so I had to kind of counsel the agent to counsel the buyers to say, look, man, this is a ticking time bomb and we all know it. So if it were my money, I would not do this. Now, here's what happened. You'll run into this. The agent on the other side said, oh, well, you must not sell a lot of homes because this is just the way it is. Well, yeah, of course the seller's agent is going to say that. Okay, so you are going to run into a lot of bullies out there. And so just because the listing agent said that does not mean that the buyers should have proceeded. And the end of the story is they did back out. And I think they dodged a bullet. Jeff, commentary?
Yeah, the deal with cast iron, and I'm surprised that the house built in 87 had cast iron drains, because I mean that was clearly just a probably a one-off builder that had some cast iron laying around and he wanted to get rid of it. But really, the issue with cast iron, it's anything that's underground is an issue with cast iron. Anything above grade, like above the slab, will last a long time. It's just it's the acidic soils here in Texas that contribute to the deterioration of cast iron. So, you know, if you are looking at a house that has cast iron, as long as the subterranean pipes have been replaced with PVC, the stuff above grade will last forever. It's just the cast iron that's in the ground. But no, that was a wise choice. That one option, or one thing that I would not recommend for cast iron or clay, do not, if you're a seller of a home with those items, do not ever allow a hydrostatic test on cast iron or clay, because the hydrostatic, even with 4 or 5 psi, will blow that pipe apart, because cast iron and clay were never intended to contain any kind of pressure. They're a drain line. So yeah, if you're representing a seller with older piping, never allow the buyer to do a hydrostatic test.
Good to know.
My question is, was it a plumber who did the inspection, or was it the inspector who did the inspection? And does that matter? Being a professional, right?
Yeah, it was just an inspector. It was not a plumber.
Okay.
Yep.
Which
Okay.
there's a lot of inspection companies offering the hydrostatic test too.
Yeah.
Which there's really a kind of a gray area there. You're not supposed to be able to do that unless you are a licensed plumber. But there's some gray area there. But I wouldn't really let a hydrostatic test happen under any situation of a property that I'm selling, because I mean, all it takes is one joint that's not glued together, and hydrostatic tests will blow apart.
That's good advice. Okay. The next thing I wanted to call out is on page 2 of this seller's disclosure, which is where you note, and if you see my cursor, water supply provided by either city, well, or MUD, which is the municipal utility district. Okay, so I think on the listing itself in the MLS, it's pretty obvious where you click yes or no. But this is where, if you want a quick reference, it's on page 2, where you would go as the seller to determine if it's in a MUD or it's not. Okay, so when they bought the house, they were told, and they pay a certain amount each month to be in that water district. And I'm going to go over another form that TAR has come out with as well. So just hang tight there. And then section 2, are you the seller aware of any defects or malfunctions in any of the following areas? And so, the way this is written, it's you need to really, you're kind of forced to be honest. Whether a seller is or not is another story, but just to kind of familiarize yourself on how this is written. Section 3, are you the seller aware of any of the following conditions? Pretty self-explanatory. And so I know it speaks to previous roof repairs. I mean, if you live in Texas for more than 10 years, you've had your roof replaced, so it's not uncommon to put yes. You just need to tell them, when that was done. So I mean, there is a level of responsibility on behalf of a seller that has to exist, where they're going to need to go to get documents and prove all this stuff, right? So it's not really a big deal that it happened. It's a big deal that you won't be able to prove it. Okay. And then section 5 is really all about, really as a result of Hurricane Harvey a few years back. It's everything to do with water damage, flood damage, being in a floodplain, all those things. Okay. And then have you received assistance from FEMA? And then section 8, this is kind of the catch-all, speaking about room additions, were things permitted properly, any violations of deed restrictions, any lawsuits, any death on the property. So just to kind of re-explain that, if there was a death on the property and it was by natural causes, suicide or accident unrelated to the condition of the property, you don't have to disclose it. If it was homicide, you do, but pretty much every other reason you do not. All right. So the thing about the MUD was the main thing, and the piping. Everything else is pretty standard, but please, again, do not fill this out for them. Don't sign it for them, and make sure that they fill this out completely. Now, the last piece is that you need to upload this to the MLS, so into the listing. So don't wait for the buyer's agent to ask you for it. If you have it and it's completed, upload that thing into the document section so that you satisfy that obligation in the contract that speaks to when they're going to get the seller's disclosure. Okay, having it in the MLS counts as it being delivered. Okay, so as a bonus, make sure you include the survey in those documents as well. And before you even think about inputting this into the MLS, please have this document done. You don't want to scramble, right? This is one of the most important, if not the most important document of the listing process. Okay, any questions on the seller's disclosure? Okay, so to follow up on the MUD discussion here, TREC has come out with a new form that is the MUD disclosure. So for years and years and years, you can even see the date is February 12th, 2024. So there's a lot of language in the 1 to 4 about, hey, buyer beware, you may be in a MUD district, and they just kind of leave it very vague as to how you figure that out. But let me just say that it is the seller's agent's responsibility to provide this information, okay? And because it was so kind of indecisive, TREC actually came out with a 2-page form for your seller to provide. And if you ever wonder whose responsibility this is, well, here it is: seller's disclosure concerning property at whatever the address is. And it goes about itemizing everything in that taxing district. You know, who's the MUD, what's the rate. Now, this is different than the property improvement district that's already formed for that. Okay, but if the seller knows all this stuff, this is what you do. All right, now, I also want to let you know that on our website, under the tab Buyers, Sellers, Leases, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's a bunch of links that is called Helpful Links for Buyers. One of which is the MUD lookup tool. And it goes directly to tceq.texas.gov website. And you can also look up the water districts this way. All right, so there is a spot to put in the address. It first gives you the map view. But I'm mentioning this because by law, MUDs have to have all their stuff now posted online. That was not the case less than 5 years ago. All right, Lily, did you have a question or comment?
All I was going to say was, wow, that's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it pretty common in San Antonio, though? I don't think I've seen that.
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, here's San Antonio. There's not a ton of them.
Yeah, but still good to have that access, and I appreciate that. So thank you.
Yeah, and you kind of find these in more rural areas. So if you clicked on this little box in San Antonio, you'd see what MUD was in here. So to your point, it looks like this is the only one. But if you click,
okay.
Yeah, and so if you click on district information, you have access. You'll see to all the reports, documents, anything that you want here. So before this existed, you could still look this up, but you had to call this person, in this case, Richard Brond, and at this number, and Richard would have to provide for you the piece of paper that said, here's what the cost is. Okay, so now this exists.
That's great.
But yeah, so as a double check on that, just know that this document also exists. So it is important. I mean, this is an extra cost each month. I mean, no, you're not paying the water department, so I guess it's not an extra charge like a PID is, but the buyer has a right to know and is legally contracted to know where they're getting their water from. Okay, so the seller, as much of a pain as this is, needs to dig out his paperwork or his closing statements or mortgage statement or tax statement and disclose this. Okay,
I know too, Brad, like Denton County that collects for like Paloma Creek and Providence and some of those areas, it's right on the tax record. So you can go out to,
Exactly.
you can go out to, just on MLS and find the information there, just on history, if nothing else,
That's a good
of the
point.
property.
So what Jeff is talking about is that in most of our MLSs, there's a tab for tax. And if you click on that tab, it's as simple as just going to the tax records and there will be a line item there. Okay, but sometimes it's not as intuitive as you, so I mean, it's not going to say, here's the MUD tax. It's going to say something confusing. So again, I mean, just because your seller wants to sell a home does not exempt them from the obligation of providing for the next buyer what they're going to inherit. Okay. All right. So that is the MUD. The last form I wanted to go over, make sure I'm hitting all my notes. Yeah. So is seller's temporary residential lease. So when would you use this? Well, you'd use this if you represented the buyer and the home they were going to go buy, that seller needed a couple of extra days after closing to move out. Now, a year and a half, 2 years ago, these were extraordinarily common because homes were flying off the market and the seller selling their home had nowhere to go. And so you'd see lease terms for 30 days. Now it says here, and I get this question a lot, notice, for use only when seller occupies the property for no more than 90 days. What happens after 90 days? It's considered a residential lease in the state of Texas. Okay, so this is, as the term implies, temporary. All right, so here's the deal. If you have not heard me express my feelings on this document, I will do so now. And that is that I hate these things. And so does our title company. So I'm not alone. And the reason is because when somebody else owns a piece of property that someone else is living in, I think that's a problem. Even if it's the original owner, because you don't know how they treated that home when they lived there. And every day that goes by that the new owner isn't living there, that creates risk. And I've seen all too often where problems arise, the most typical of which is they don't move out. And so now you're in an eviction situation. And who do they always call? You, as their former agent. And unfortunately, we can't help them. We can advise them on, kind of what the eviction process is and maybe some next steps, but we can't represent them in the manner that we did before. So I guess my guideline is that if a seller is asking for more than 4 or 5 days, I would push back on that. And so because in my mind, are you really ready to sell this thing? Like, why aren't you ready to move out now? And so it's not your buyer's problem if that's the case. All right, so always remember that. So, however, if you have to do this, now, funny enough, there's also a buyer's temporary residential lease, which I think is even sillier. That means the seller is going to allow the buyer to rent their own property between a point in time and the time that they close. What could go wrong? But today we're just going to talk about the seller's temporary residential lease. So parties to the transaction are going to be here. The lease. So landlord leases the tenant to the property described in the contract between landlord as buyer and tenant as seller, known as whatever the address is. And so this is important. Paragraph 3. The term of this lease starts on the date the sale covered by the contract is closed and funded. Okay, so the closing date, and then terminates, and that blank is a date, not 7 days from that date. It's the date. Okay, unless terminated earlier by reason of other provisions. The next important part is the money. Paragraph 4, tenant shall pay to landlord as rental a certain amount per day, excluding the day of closing, with the full amount of rental for the term of the lease to be paid at the time of funding of the sale. That means if the seller thought that they needed 7 days, but is only going to take 4, they're paying for 7 days and not getting that money back. End of story. Okay, so what I typically do is I take an average of, if it's, I don't know, $300,000 to $600,000 home, rent on that's going to be about $2,500. Let's just say, for example, divide that by 30 days, and that's about $83 a day. So I would start there and maybe ratchet that down if you just want to be reasonable. Some sellers want it for free. I don't have a feeling either way. But if you're going to give it to them for free, you better charge a deposit, which is paragraph 5. Okay, I don't care if you're doing it for free or you're charging $83 a day. I would get a deposit, and I would do it for at least $1,000, because here's what will happen. This goes back to the home wasn't clean enough to move into. I'm going to roll with this cleaning thing today. They will leave it a shambles sometimes, because there is a certain disconnect that happens when the seller moves out of their own home that says, ain't my problem anymore. And they'll leave it a mess. So you want money to be able to cover any unreasonable amount of wear and tear. Now, hopefully in this same contract, the buyer has put in that first paragraph, house needs to be professionally cleaned upon move out. That solves that problem. But you would be amazed at what happens when that original seller moves out. So get a deposit. And then it says in typical, just like a typical residential lease would be, a list of all deductions from that deposit is due within 30 days. So just because the seller wants their money back immediately doesn't mean you give it to them. All right. You as the buyer need to do another walkthrough when they move out and make sure that the property is in the same condition it was when you inked that contract. All right, paragraph 6, make sure that utilities are paid for by whoever you decide. Okay, make sure that you know about the pets, the condition of the property, any alterations, and I would put in here in special provisions that house is to be professionally cleaned upon move out. All right, now, because it's important, it's underlined. Paragraph 14, this is where I've seen this backfire. Except as otherwise provided in the lease, tenant, who is now the old owner, shall bear all expense of repairing and maintaining the property, including but not limited to the yard, trees, shrubs, unless otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act of omission of the tenant or any person other than the landlord, landlord's agents, or invitees. And so I've seen where a leaseback occurs and the air conditioning breaks. And so as this reads, even though the old owners don't own it anymore, they are responsible. Okay, so you can kind of see where this incurs risk for both people, because there's going to be a lot of this going on if that AC breaks. And I've also seen huge hail and windstorms come through on the day of closing for somebody, and closing is derailed. And so what if that happens when there's a lease back? Like, who pays for that? Okay, so all of this is included in here. And there is also, insurance. So paragraph 16, landlord and tenant shall each maintain such insurance on the contents and property as each party may deem appropriate during the term of this lease. Note, consult your insurance agent. Possession of the property by seller as tenant may change insurance policy coverage. So the way I read this is that both people have to have insurance on that property during this term. okay, for obvious reasons. All right. So, in paragraph 18, to kind of speak to the prepayment thing, this lease terminates upon expiration of the term specified in paragraph 3 or upon tenant's default under the lease. So in other words, if they ask for 7 days and they moved out on day 4, they ain't getting a refund. Okay. All right. So that is a brief explanation on the seller's temporary residential lease, or commonly called leaseback, and kind of where my pain points are. Does anybody have a question, comment?
Item 19, Brad, the holdover amount. I say you want to keep that, you want to make that pretty stiff, like $500 a day or something pretty significant.
Good point. So to Jeff's point, this is when they don't move out. So tenant shall surrender possession of the property upon the termination of the lease. Any possession by the tenant after the termination creates a tenancy at sufferance and will not operate to renew or extend the lease. In other words, you're squatting after the lease is over. And if that happens, the tenant's going to pay, to Jeff's point, a pretty high amount per day during the period of any possession after termination as damages, in addition to any other remedies to which landlord is entitled. So when would this happen? Well, you know, maybe they wanted 7 days, but they couldn't coordinate the movers and they need an extra day. You know, you might ding them for that holdover rate then, or, you know, you might come to an agreement that you can have an extra day. But when they see that big fat number there as what their penalty might be, that's an encouragement to get out when the lease term expires. Okay.
Ask me why I do that now.
Why do you do that now?
Yeah, we had a situation where we allowed someone to do a lease back and they squatted, and we had like, you know, $30 a day or something. You know, I would say at least make it the amount of a very nice hotel room.
Yeah.
Per night.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions on this document or any contract that we've reviewed today, or any just general contract questions? Yeah, I mean, to Jeff's point, I'm really not an extreme thinker, but I don't really think of like the worst case scenario. I certainly consider, but I don't ever think that it's actually going to happen. But I will tell you that housing is at a premium and rental rates are high and people do stupid stuff. And so it's not unusual to get someone in there that's not going to leave until they're forced to. And if you don't know how to do that, that can be very debilitating for a customer. So you don't want to put people in that situation. So if you can avoid a lease back, I would do it. But if you can't avoid it, please make it as strict as possible.
You know, Brad, to your point earlier too, to, you know, maybe avoid a seller's temporary lease back. If they only need a handful of days, consider seeing if they would move the closing date out a few days.
Yeah.
So that, you know, just close later if it works for everybody.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, cool. Well, if there aren't any other questions, that kind of concludes what I had to go over today. So next week, just a traditional office meeting. We'll kind of review the stats from February and talk about a couple of miscellaneous things, and just kind of continue on from there. So we'll see you back here next Thursday at 1. And you guys have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you. You too.